Good evening, folks, and welcome back to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Maria Gutierrez Vera, and I'm one of your 3 Athenaeum Fellows this year. "70 years ago, Australian psychiatrist John Cade discovered the calming effect that lithium, a silvery mineral, had on guinea pigs in his lab. This discovery, advanced by Danish and American researchers, isolated lithium carbonate as an effective treatment for bipolar disorder. Today, lithium carbonate is hailed by the American Psychiatric Association as the best and most effective mood stabilizer available on the market. The commercial success of lithium, antipsychotic, and antidepressive medicine set off the psychopharmacological revolution of the 1950s. In the years since, a bevy of pharmaceutical drugs have flooded the market and become the only approved treatments for mental health and other psychiatric conditions. However, proponents of the psychedelic therapy movement, including tonight's speaker, Dr. Dan Kelly, argue that there are other, perhaps more effective ways to treat depression, anxiety, PTSD, and even substance use disorders. These treatments involve the monitored ingestion of substances such as MDMA, ketamine, and psilocybin, the active ingredient in psychedelic mushrooms. Tonight, Dr. Kelly will be speaking about his research on psychedelic-assisted therapy through the Pacific Treatment and Research in Psychedelics program, abbreviated TRIP. The Pacific Brain Health Center writes that TRIP is dedicated to the appropriate medical use of psychedelic-assisted therapy to heal the mind, improve brain health, and enhance quality of life. Currently, TRIP is focused on lasting improvements for conditions such as major depression, PTSD, anxiety disorders, end-of-life, palliative care, as well as drug and alcohol use disorders. Dr. Daniel Kelly is the director and founder of the Pacific Neuroscience Institute and professor of neurosurgery at St. John's Cancer Institute at Providence St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, California. Kelly is a graduate of Claremont McKenna College and Georgetown Medical School. He is considered to be one of the top neurosurgeons in the U.S., is a multiple recipient of the Patient's Choice Award, and has been awarded the Southern California Super Doctor's Distinction 15 years in a row. Before we begin, we must ask that you all abide by the Athenaeum's health guidelines. Please keep your masks on over your nose and mouth for the entirety of the program indoors. If you would like to take a drink, we kindly ask that you leave the Eggert dining room to do so. Take a moment now to silence your cell phones, ensure your mask is properly fitted, and remember that, as always, video and audio recording are strictly prohibited. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Kelly to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum.
Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Priya. And thank you, John Spinoza, if you're listening. John was a classmate of mine, a year ahead of me, I think. And we connected recently. I haven't talked to him for years, and he told me about this, and he got me conned into giving this talk to you guys tonight. So thank John Spinoza. Dave McGrublian, I haven't seen you for decades either. Great to see you, and thanks for all you do for CMC. Before I start, I just want to say it's so nice to be back on campus, and when I look down that way, it's like nothing has changed in 40 years, which is pretty amazing. And I just think you all, I know you know it, but how lucky you all are to be here on the Claremont colleges. And I do have to confess, though, that my daughter is one of my daughters is a graduate of Pomona, class of 2020. And we spent a lot of time here. My wife and I came here frequently because she played volleyball, and of course they got crushed by CMC regularly, but that's okay. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about a very hot topic, a super interesting topic, and I think one that is going to transform the neurosciences and behavioral health care. And you may ask, why would a neurosurgeon get into this line of work? And it's precisely that, because I think that this is going to be a game changer. Again, it's actually an old story, which is why I titled my talk Past, Present, and Future of Psychedelic-Assisted Therapies. And so without further ado, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of where I came from, Pacific Neuroscience Institute, and then get into the history, talk about some clinical trials, and talk about the things that we're doing in our group. Our group is very young in getting into this. But I'll let you know what we're up to. So at Pacific Neuroscience Institute, this is a group of now about 36 clinicians across 10 specialties. You can see our mission here. It's really about precision multidisciplinary patient care and advancing the neurosciences and promoting brain health through novel research and innovative clinical trials. And the TRIP program really is right there, and that's what this is about. And we also want to be involved in training the next generation of clinician and research neuroscientists and educating the community. And that's part of what this is about, is educating you all about what's going on in this very important field. When I started at the John Wayne Cancer Institute, went to St. John's back in 2007, we were really focused on these areas: brain tumors, pituitaries, eye, ear, and skull-based disorders with a research entity. And then we advanced into all these other centers of excellence, with the brain health program being the most recent one, which we started in 2018 with a focus on sort of collaborative diagnostics and evidence-based therapies. And so a number of different healthcare, mental health care providers, and really with the hopes of not only providing standard of care, but clinical trials and breakthrough therapies. So when we started Brain Health, our initial focus was on dementia and memory issues. But neuromuscular area, we have a cognitive fitness program, movement disorders, an MS program. And then more recently, we've been focused on what we would call mood disorders: depression, anxiety, addiction. And this is where the TRIP program came into being. So why would we do this? So if you think about what I do, my day job is in brain tumors. That's what I take care of. 300,000 approximately cases per year. Stroke, very big. Alzheimer's, dementia, huge problem. But when you look at these other problems of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and addiction, they dwarf these other neuroscience ailments. And the other most important point is that for many patients, our current therapies really have limited success, side effects, and they just don't last very long. They lack durability. And so why would we go back to this very ancient story? Well, there's obviously something to this story. And shamanistic cultures for thousands and thousands of years have been using some of these plant and fungal entheogens, such as ayahuasca, peyote, psilocybin, mescaline, which is what San Pedro cactus has, and having very, very beneficial effects on people. But keep in mind that individuals the shamans are prescribing these, giving them to patients, and being very careful in the way they're being used. It's actually even an older story. This is Terence McKenna here, and I don't know if any of you have read this book, Food of the Gods. There's a theory that he came up with back in the 70s and 80s called the Stoned Ape Theory, and this is actually from a snip from Louis Schwartzberg movie Fantastic Fungi. I don't know if any of you have seen that. With the hypothesis being that part of human evolution, the rapid evolution of our intellectual capabilities, was because our ancestors like Homo erectus, Australopithecus were eating psychedelic mushrooms. And because of the synaptogenesis and neurogenesis, these things were helping the brain evolve and grow, and that it's actually part of our human evolution. And this theory was really sort of dismissed quite a bit, but actually recently people are looking at it more seriously, and there may be something to it. It's an interesting thought. The sort of modern era of psychedelics really begins with Arthur Hefter. He was a German pharmacologist and chemist, and he identified mescaline as the active alkaloid in peyote back in the almost around 1900. And he did this by himself, by trying the different alkaloids and proving that this was the psychedelic active ingredient. The real modern era of psychedelics was Albert Hoffman. And this is a fascinating story of how Albert Hoffman, who was a research chemist studying plant and animal chemistries in Basel, Switzerland, accidentally dosed himself in 1943. And this is his account of this. I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. He was not sure what it was, and so 3 days later, on April 19th, he gave himself an additional dose, and he confirmed that that was in fact what he had taken. He had the first, deliberate LSD dosing. And that is now April 19th, for those of you who don't know, is now officially called Bicycle Day in Switzerland because he rode home on his bicycle, tripping on LSD. And that's true. Albert Hoffman went on to be quite an influencer in the psychedelic world. He wrote this book, LSD, My Problem Child, given all the issues, the cultural and political problems it created. But he was a huge promoter of it, and he lived to be 102 years old. And he took a lot of LSD and psilocybin along the way. Sandoz, the company he was working for, went on to produce LSD and psilocybin for commercial and pharmaceutical use in 1947 for LSD, 1959 for psilocybin. Albert Hoffman was also the one who took the dried mushrooms from Mexico that were brought to him and proved that that was the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. And so from the 50s to the 70s, with these drugs available, psychedelics were intensely investigated for their therapeutic potential for things such as addiction, depression, and cancer-related distress. There was over 1,000 publications and over 40,000 research subjects. It was mainstream psychiatry in those days. Some of the people really involved in this was a psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond from Canada. He treated over 2,000 alcoholics with LSD, and by report, about 50% of his subjects were able to quit drinking. This other colorful individual, Captain Alfred Hubbard, was another big proponent. He did his first LSD experience at age 49, almost 50 years old, and then was a huge proponent going all over the country trying to get people to take LSD. A lot of this is summarized in this very interesting and somewhat funny book called Acid Dreams. I would highly recommend it if you want more history. This all had a big impact on Aldous Huxley and was really the setting for him writing in 1954, The Doors of Perception. And one of the famous quotes from that book is, "Each one of us is potentially mind at large." And this is after his mescaline experience that was supervised by Humphrey Osmond, the psychiatrist from Canada. But insofar as we are animals, our business is at all costs to survive. To make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. What comes out at the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness which help us stay alive on the surface of this particular planet. So he thought that psychedelics really opened up the mind. There was something much greater going on here. And this book caught the attention of a lot of people. This individual, Gordon Wasson, was a businessman in New York. He was a banker. He actually went into Mexico seeking the magic mushroom. There was all these tales of people down there providing this. He met this curandera, and he was the one who actually gave Albert Hoffman the psilocybin mushrooms that he ultimately synthesized and confirmed the compound. This got a young Harvard professor named Timothy Leary very excited about psilocybin. He was frustrated with his work, and he thought this might be an interesting way to go. And this is referred to as the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and then Richard Albert all started looking at this with students at Harvard. Imagine this is a brand new thing. Imagine at Claremont this happening. They started giving it to college students. There were no IRBs. There was very little supervision. It got out of hand very quickly. But most importantly, Timothy Leary, for all the grief he gets over the years, he was the one who really came up with this concept of set and setting, which is the mindset of the individual and the setting in which the psychedelic journey occurs. Who you're with, how much you take, the music you listen to, those sorts of things. And this is still really the core of this therapy, which I'll get into in a little bit. Well, Timothy Leary and Richard Albert were summarily dismissed from Harvard not so long after this. Richard Albert went on to become Ram Dass, who many of you may know, and he subsequently died, went to India for a long time, wrote an incredible book called Be Here Now. Timothy Leary, in the meantime, was promoting turn on, tune in, and drop out. And he was called by Richard Nixon the most dangerous man in America. And this is when everything sort of came off, the wheels came off, because these guys went totally off the reservation with the scientific work they were doing, inspired groups like the Grateful Dead, and really the drug culture did get very, very out of hand, with almost a third of the armed forces taking all sorts of illicit drugs. And because of this, despite the promising preliminary findings, the psychedelic research really was shut down after the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970. And that's where it went. And it stayed really in the deep freeze for almost 30 years. And, but as you all know, and part of the reason I'm here is to tell you that psychedelics are back in a big way. And if you haven't read Michael Pollan's book, which came out in 2018, How to Change Your Mind, that's a great place to start. He's an amazing author. But there's been much, much more, and it's hard not to see where psychedelics is being discussed. Ira Byock is one of our doctors in the Providence Network, which St. John's Health Center is part of. He wrote this editorial in the Washington Post. There was many editorials come up. This was in the May New York Times about the psychedelic revolution is coming. Psychiatry may never be the same. Ira wrote a paper in the Journal of Palliative Medicine. He's a palliative care doctor, and there's a lot of use of this in people who have the existential crisis of terminal illness or cancer, for example. This was the third most read paper in that journal in 2018. It's been on 60 Minutes. This featured the Johns Hopkins group. And there's everywhere you look. This is very, very common. I think this was in Rolling Stone on a ibogaine, a 12-step program for addiction. One of the most interesting things going on now is that there are decriminalization laws occurring. Denver and the city of Denver and Oregon are the first to do that. And no one knows exactly where this is going, but it may change the economics of this and the use. And there's also a Senate bill running through the state of California called Bill 519, which would decriminalize the possession and non-commercial sharing of psychedelics for many different types of psychedelics, LSD, mushrooms, MDMA, ayahuasca, and others. And so we'll see where this is going to go, but this is really happening and moving very, very fast. The leaders of the Psychedelic Renaissance are a really interesting group, and this is a sort of an incomplete list, but Rick Doblin, who's part of MAPS, which I'll talk about, Roland Griffiths, who's at Johns Hopkins, Charlie Grobe, who's at Harbor UCLA and who I know and am good friends with. I'll talk a little bit about his trial, and others. Dennis McKenna is the brother of Terrence McKenna, who died. He's an ethnopharmacologist. Bob Jesse was the one who got Roland Griffiths at the Hopkins to start their psychedelics program around 1999, way ahead of the curve. Franz Vollenweider, Dave Nichols, who's a pharmacologist, knows how to look and work with all these molecules. David Nutt, great name for a guy studying psychedelics from the Imperial College of London, a brilliant guy. And Andrew Weil, who's the father of integrative medicine. And a number of groups have sprung up, MAPS, the Hefter Institute, the Beckley Foundation, and the USONA Institute. We're working very closely with USONA now, and that's where we get our psilocybin for our trials. And I'll talk about CIIS, California Institute of Integrated Studies, in a little bit. So, you know, this movement is changing institutions. So the Imperial College of London became the world's first center for psychedelics research after a big donation. The same year, back in 2019, Johns Hopkins, who's really been ahead of the curve, along with Imperial College of London, got a $17 million donation. And this is Roland Griffiths and Matthew Johnson. So there's a lot of money flowing into this area. And so now let's talk a little bit about why all the excitement. Let's talk a little bit about the what I would call the science of spirituality, or maybe it's the spirituality of science. You know, one of the things we know for sure is that we have a limited perspective on the universe. We see very little of the light waves, and we don't hear that much compared to a lot of animals and what's out there. And Stan Grof, who started holotropic breath work, he has this phrase, which is now often quoted, that psychedelics are like the telescope to astronomy and the microscope to biology. And I think it's a very, very apt description. In a book on holotropic breath work, Jack Kornfield, who's a Buddhist meditator type, very interested in psychedelics, wrote this: "The prevailing materialistic culture has created a divided world where the sacred is relegated to churches and temples, the body to the gym, mental health to pills from the pharmacy. Economic growth is pursued as if it had nothing to do with environment, and ignorance, racism, and warfare continue to separate people and nations. These divisions are the great suffering they produce. These divisions and the great suffering they produce result from a restricted and limited human consciousness." And I think a lot of people working in this area, in the psychedelic renaissance, feel that this restricted and limited human consciousness can be changed with psychedelic-assisted therapy. So what do? So psilocybin and LSD are considered the classic psychedelics. They are serotonergic agonists, and they lead to introspection, new insights, altered perspective. I'm sure you all know this, but this is really what they do. They're referred to as entheogens. MDMA, on the other hand, is not as visual. It's also referred to as an empathogen. It's a little bit more messy from a neurotransmitter standpoint. It's also a serotonin agonist, but it acts on dopamine, noradrenaline. Oxytocin is probably an important target. And it results in prominent emotional effects of warmth and empathy and openness. You may have seen this image. This comes from the group at Imperial College of London, and this is a functional MRI study in 15 healthy volunteers. And what this is showing is a schematic of global neural networks, and I think this is a very good way to think about how these drugs or plant or fungal compounds work. So this is on placebo, and this is on psilocybin. And really what you see here is what is often referred to as our sort of ego-dominated world versus ego dissolution. So most of the neural networks in your head, they communicate with just a few networks, and that's what's shown here. You can see the blues communicate with the blues, the greens with the greens. There's not a lot of crosstalk. When you're on a full dose of psilocybin, everything is opened up. All these neural networks are talking to different networks, and it's thought that this is really where the therapeutic efficacy comes in. And this ego dissolution and subsequently a mystical or spiritual experience is really thought to be where the therapeutic effect happens. So if you take psilocybin, an oral dose begins within about 20 to 30 minutes. It peaks within about an hour and persists for 2 hours. A full trip usually lasts around 5 or 6 hours. It obviously alters your mood, your emotions, your cognition, and your perceptions. And at the higher doses, the dose that we use in our clinical trials is 25 milligrams. That equates to about 4 milligrams of dried mushrooms. It's a big dose. Then you get things like more profound introspection, derealization, dreamlike states, visual hallucinations, synesthesias where colors take on sounds and vice versa, and profound alterations in space and time. And it's thought, going back to this idea of the neural networks, that the mystical or spiritual experience occurs by disrupting what's referred to as the default mode network. This is really where the ego lives. This is where you worry about the future, you fret about the past, you ruminate on things. And it's comprised of a number of brain structures, which I won't go into, but this has been mapped out, and there are fMRIs and PET studies. This is a wonderful review, very brief, that came out by David Nutt and the group at Imperial College of London, just making the case for psychedelics impacting psychiatry and showing some of the work that they've done. But one of the important things to note is that the idea is that for depression, for addiction, for OCD and anorexia, it's about this rumination that people have. It's these recursive thoughts. And what seems to happen in the psychedelic sessions is these ruminations are shut down and other epiphanies occur because the brain is allowed to have all these connections, these neural networks communicating that don't normally communicate. And it allows people to get out of the rut that they're in, and with profound effects. This is again, the reducing valve of the brain, as Aldous Huxley called it. And so Dr. Winkelmann, who's an evolutionary biologist in Arizona, he describes it this way: psychedelic disruption of the default mode network results in an overall reduction of top-down brain control, a disruption of the functioning control habitually exercised by the frontal cortex. Psychedelics increase functional connectivity among normally segregated networks. And the visuals say it all. Also, he believes, and many others, that these effects help to explain increase in imagination, novel thinking, and creativity experienced during psychedelic states. This may be part of the reason that people in Silicon Valley are microdosing a lot and doing micro and macro doses. This whole idea of imagination and novel thinking is an important concept to consider. So this idea of a mystical experience is really important. And it has been defined by Walter Pahnke and Bill Richards many years ago. They defined this in their early studies before things were shut down. This is from 1966. And the 6 components of what they refer to as a mystical experience is unity, a sense of oneness with the universe, transcendence of time and space, this sort of boundless, oceanic boundlessness, an intuitive knowledge or a noetic feeling, just what you're experiencing is, you know it's true. It's sacred, there's a certain awesomeness to it, it gives you a positive mood, and yet it's ineffable. It's often very hard to describe and to put in words, and there's certain paradoxicality to it. But studies have shown if you have this and it's measurable, this is really what leads to these ideas of openness, empathy, love, and new meaning and perspective. And I think this is really sort of the core context of the mystical experience. And what has been shown time and time again in these studies across these different ailments is that whether or not a mystical experience is achieved is the best predictor of the therapeutic response, even when it's challenging. And that's a very important concept. When it's challenging, a so-called bad trip. And that doesn't happen, I'll talk a little bit about it more, but challenging is good in this situation because you have someone with you, you have guides with you who are going to help you navigate through the difficult part. So let me get into some of the studies that have been done, just some of the data, because data is important. I know that at Claremont, data is a big thing, okay? So I'm going to try and show you some data here. It's not all just, woo-woo and mysticism, okay? So this was the first paper that came out in psychopharmacology in 2006 from the Hopkins group, and this was in normal individuals, and they recruited them from the local surroundings, and it was promoted as a study of consciousness using a psychoactive substance. And they used this mysticism scale and state of consciousness questionnaire. And what's really most interesting, first of all, it was safe. And you can see these gigantic p-values compared to the control substance, methylphenidate. But what's really most interesting, how personally meaningful was the experience? Almost 60% said it was among the top 5 experiences they'd ever had as an adult. That's pretty impressive. This next study that came out at Harbor UCLA, where I was for many years, I didn't actually know Charlie Grobe then, but he was doing this. This was published in 2011 in a small study, 12 patients with end-stage cancer, and he looked at anxiety, and it was with psilocybin. It was double-blind, placebo-controlled, and very significant drops in anxiety and depression in this group. These studies were replicated in much larger studies at NYU and at Hopkins, and this was in 2016. The Hopkins study came out then. The NYU study came out around the same time. Bigger, 51 cancer patients, still a phase 2 trial, but at 6 months, depression and anxiety were reduced in about 80% of the patients really profound, strong effects. And they concluded that a single dose can produce substantial, enduring decreases in anxiety and depression with cancer. And again, no serious adverse events. And again, when they looked at the spirituality and mystical experience, again, a majority of the individuals said this was the most meaningful, one of their most meaningful lifetime experiences and most spiritually significant. So profound experiences. And Roland Griffiths was interviewed. I saw him once say that when they first started seeing this, he said, well, these people must have really boring lives. But it's something they just see over and over again. And this is, you know, you can go through 10 years of therapy and make some progress, but you can have one well-done psilocybin journey and you can achieve a lot of things. And I think that's what's so game-changing about this. Big question, can psilocybin combined with meditation make you a better person? They looked at this in combining psilocybin with meditation and other spiritual practices, and they looked over a fairly long period of time. At 6 months, psilocybin and a meditation or spiritual practice led to all of these changes: interpersonal closeness, gratitude, life meaning, forgiveness. I'm sure we all know someone who could use a little enhancement in these areas, right? And so this is really, I think, an important study on the concept of the worried well, you know, the betterment of normal individuals, of seeing a bigger picture. And I think that's going to be an open area. A big study came out just in April in New England Journal of Medicine. This was a randomized controlled trial of psilocybin versus Lexapro, a common selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor that's used for depression. And this trial was actually a little bit of a disappointment for people because the way they constructed the study, the primary outcome measure basically showed similar outcomes, whether they were on Lexapro or psilocybin. But when they looked at all the secondary measures, it favored psilocybin by a long shot. And I think that is really the take-home message here. And again, no serious adverse events. So very well done, controlled study. Small study, 59 patients. So we need bigger studies. What about addiction? So again, small studies are going on in tobacco and alcoholism, and we have one which I'll talk about. And these have been really impressive in psilocybin for both. In this small study at Hopkins, and they have a much bigger study going on right now. So only 15 patients, but they were getting psilocybin in 2 or 3 sessions with cognitive behavioral therapy, but they had 80% of the subjects stopped smoking. Really impressive. That's the best numbers in the literature with, say, Xanterix or other methods of stopping is only about 25%. So orders of magnitude better than with standard treatments. This small alcohol study, and they're doing a bigger one now at NYU, only 10 patients, and they found that abstinence significantly decreased after psilocybin. And both of these studies, again, showed this correlation with the mystical experience. So the more profound the experience was, the more likely they were to cease either their smoking or their drinking. If you go on clinicaltrials.gov right now, I'm sure many of you have seen this, you can type in psilocybin and any ailment and you can come up, and right now you get about 58 trials that are either completed or opening or recruiting for a whole variety of ailments. So there's a lot going on. There's some going on in anorexia and OCD, these sort of ruminating syndromes. And even LSD. LSD is making a slower move, a slower comeback, I think, as LSD has so much cultural stigmata behind it. Psilocybin doesn't scare people as much. LSD also lasts a lot longer. So an LSD trip is more like 10 hours than 5 or 6 with psilocybin. So it's a lot more work in terms of setting up a clinical trial around it. You probably have to have the patients spend the night in the clinic. But again, suffice it to say, in areas of depression, anxiety, cluster, headache. And then there's some very good mechanistic studies, people just wondering how do these compounds work. So lots of great work going on. And then PTSD. And really the leading group on this is MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And this was all started by this guy, Rick Doblin, when he was much younger in around 1983. This is him with Albert Hoffman, with big smiles on their faces. And this is Rick Doblin. He started this whole process of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. He started working on this in the 1980s, and they're just now into their phase 3 trials. And he still has a big smile on his face, though, because they have accomplished so much. They're way ahead of where psilocybin is. And they just published in Nature Medicine, this paper just came out a few months ago, their first phase 3 trial. 90 patients, a more complex treatment paradigm, again with 2 guides, but 3 prep sessions, 3 experimental sessions, meaning 3 sessions with MDMA over an 18-week period, and 9 integration sessions. These are after they have the journey, they meet with the guides again about the issues that they came up with. What's important about this with PTSD, it's impactful for all types of PSD. It can be domestic violence, it can be rape, it can be warfare, it can be policemen, firemen. It seems to be effective for all groups. And this is just showing some more of the data, but what they published is that 2/3 in the MDMA group compared to placebo no longer met criteria for PTSD at 18 weeks. That's very, very impressive numbers. And so, the mechanism, again, very interesting. How does this work? And it may work by allowing patients, we think it allows patients to stay more emotionally engaged while revisiting the traumatic experiences without becoming overwhelmed. And that's how they get through it. And it may be related to oxytocin, this oxytocin-dependent critical period of neuroplasticity. It allows this plasticity of the brain that is mediated through oxytocin and allows people to process some of their fear-related memories. So more work to be done on this. And what MAPS is doing now is their second phase 3 trial. It's in progress. It's very far along. And that's why MDMA may be approved, hopefully in the next year or 2 at the most. It'll be the first one out. So if we look at the numbers across the way, depression, anxiety, smoking, you can see what standard therapy offers. And these small phase 2 trials are coming up with much bigger numbers, but they're small, and they have to be replicated with larger samples. The issue of safety is important, and this was a paper from the Hopkins group about safety guidelines, and this has been very helpful. And it's really about avoiding this idea of a bad trip. And, if you take LSD or psilocybin at a party and you're on the 10th floor of a building and you think you can fly, you're having this incredible time and you jump off the building, well, that's going to be a bad trip. In the clinical setting, in a clinic and where we're doing it, it's a much different deal. And, you're prepared for it. You have meetings with the psychologist or the addiction medicine people. You have 2 people with you. I'll get into this a little bit. But it's a very different thing. And all these studies now to date, there have been no serious adverse events in any of the phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trials for LSD or psilocybin or MDMA for that matter. So that's really important because a lot of people are worried about this thing going off the rails again, and that's why there's some worry about these decriminalization laws having an impact in a bad way on people doing things that are unsafe. And if you look at something called the harm scale, this is a very interesting study that came out of the UK, looking at the relative harm to users and the relative harm to others of all these compounds. And you can see that ecstasy, which is MDMA, LSD, and mushrooms are at the very, very far end of the harm scale. And very important to note, you cannot overdose on LSD or psilocybin. You can't. The LD50 is really not known. You can overdose on all these other things up here, alcohol, heroin, crack cocaine, methamphetamine. And the other thing is LSD, psilocybin, and ecstasy, they are not addictive. The serotonin system is not an addictive system. And so very important for people to realize that, but nonetheless, all of these drugs are still stuck in Schedule 1, meaning they have no known utility in medical circles. That's where they are now. But we know that that's not the case. So when we think about psychedelic-assisted therapy, and this is sort of a picture, this is a picture from the Hopkins group of an individual on a couch with eye shades and music, and the two guides there. I think of it almost as a procedure. What I do, minimally invasive brain tumor removal. It's very similar in terms of trying to have an excellent outcome. So careful patient selection and screening, pre-treatment preparation, experienced clinicians, and the appropriate setting, monitoring, and safety measures. So it is a procedure. It's a procedure on the brain, so to speak. And the careful follow-up is key. And so there is a lot of effort that goes into keeping these things safe. And the mantra that is given to individuals who go on these journeys is trust, let go, and be open. Let the drug, the compound, the plant, the fungal medicine take you where it's going to go. One of the important concepts are the guides. And the Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research, this is at California Institute of Integral Studies, CIIS, is in San Francisco. This is a course and program run by Janice Phelps. I'm actually taking it now myself. And it's a wonderful course on psychedelic-assisted therapies and research. And our program director, Keith Heinzerling, who's an addiction medicine specialist, took it as well. There's about 200 people in the course now, half in Boston, half in San Francisco. It's way oversubscribed. But this is really a critical part of making these compounds safe, about how it's done and what the guides do. And I won't read all of those things, but you got to have these competencies to be a good therapist in this setting. And this is open to marriage and family counselors, psychologists, MDs, clergy, sort of a wide swath of individuals. So how does it work? So the treatment model that we use now in our studies and what has been used is this period of preparation where you discuss with the patient, why do you want to do this? What are your intentions? Is it for alcoholism? Is it because of depression? You have cancer? And it's usually one session or maybe two sessions. But this is really the set and setting. So after the preparation, you have the journey itself, which, as I said, for psilocybin goes on for about 6 hours. Then the integration, these meetings afterwards about what you encountered and kind of putting it all into context of your life and what are you going to do to change? Because a lot of the hard work happens after the journey. And so you have this period of profound altered consciousness, then expanded consciousness, hopefully, and then these persisting improvements in your mood, your insights, and your behavior. And that's really how it works. So at TRIP, at Pacific Neuroscience, our mission is really to develop safe and effective and FDA-approved psychedelic-assisted therapies for these different disorders. And right now we're doing it obviously through clinical trials, although we're doing ketamine-assisted therapy, which is already approved. We really want to try to understand some of these scientific questions around how do these drugs work? What are the underlying mechanisms? And we want to make sure that these compounds are available to those who need it. And that's a real issue right now, and there's a lot of demand out there. And we're doing this partly in partnership, our P&I Foundation and our St. John's Health Center Foundation, our philanthropic arm. And so right now we're focused on psilocybin, eventually MDMA, LSD, and we're using ketamine already. And so what have we accomplished so far? So since May of 2019, we were very fortunate to get some initial funding from the Annenberg Foundation through one of our doctors at St. John's. We hired Keith Heinzerling, who's a wonderful guy. He's done all the heavy lifting. He's an addiction medicine specialist. We built out our TRIP suite, and we hired facilitators. We started ketamine-assisted therapy. One of the hardest things that Keith had to do is get a DEA Schedule I license. We also had to install a 700-pound safe in the suite to store these tiny little pills of psilocybin. It had to be bolted to the floor so they can't be carried off. This is what the DEA makes you do. We've launched our first trial of psilocybin and a visual healing protocol in collaboration with Louis Schwartzberg, who did Fantastic Fungi. I'll talk to you about that a little bit more. And we've actually enrolled, we're almost 3/4 of the way of our enrollment for alcohol use disorder. And we're about to start the USONA trial. This is the group we're working with that is providing the psilocybin for us for major depression. This is a multi-center trial, and we're joining that trial. Any day now, we'll start enrolling patients. We have a COVID-related grief study that we're going to do for people who have lost someone in the pandemic and have been unable to grieve properly. And then we're looking at other trials, a number of different ones in depression, anxiety, and brain tumor patients. Brain tumor patients I take care of, for many, many years. They're excluded from all these studies. People are worried they're going to have a seizure, when in fact there's no data that psilocybin, for example, lowers the seizure threshold. In fact, almost all the antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs lower the seizure threshold. So hopefully we'll be the first group to study brain tumor patients with psilocybin. We're looking at LSD and MDA for stroke and MCI. This is another totally different area of the potential for synaptogenesis and neurogenesis with these compounds, and in chronic disorders like chronic stroke and mild cognitive impairment before they go into dementia, even TBI, traumatic brain injury. And then there's another study potentially using LSD for anxiety. So, we want to be part of this road to FDA approval. And right now, the phase 2 trials for psilocybin, it's all phase 2 trials. We're working with USONA. The only phase 3 trials now are in MDMA for PTSD, but hopefully this is going to lead to FDA approval. That's Dr. Heinzerling right there. And right now there's very, very little federal funding. All of these trials have been funded by private philanthropy, and hopefully that will change. So this is our team. This is Dr. Heinzerling, Shanti Goinanthan. She's a psycho-oncologist and will be very involved in the depression trial. Our director of the Brain Health Center, and our 2 guides, Micah Linton and Karina Sergey, who are going to be involved in, they're already involved in the alcohol trial and will be involved in the depression trial. And we have a wonderful group of collaborators, including Francois Borzad and Chris Adrian, who will be working on this COVID-related grief trial. Ira Bayak, who I mentioned, Charlie Grove, and Matt Johnson from Hopkins. Charles Raison works at USONA. And then finally, Louis Schwartzberg. And I want to spend a little bit talking about Louis. How many of you have seen Fantastic Fungi? Okay, well, the rest of you need to see it. Okay. So our clinic is on the 5th floor of this building in Santa Monica, close to the St. John's Health Center. And we have a lot of beautiful art. We have some of Louis' art from his movie. We also have this big flat panel monitor, which I'll explain to you why we have that. And again, supported in part from the Annenberg Foundation. So Keith and I met Louis at a psychedelics conference in Madison, Wisconsin, back in May of 2019. And it turns out Louis is very good friends with my brother, who was at National Geographic for many years. And this was right when Fantastic Fungi came out. And Louis is a world-class cinematographer of nature films. He shows things very small, very big, very slow, very fast. He's an unbelievably patient man, wonderful soul. And this was the movie that came out, and it really highlighted the work of Paul Stamets, who's a mycologist and a phenomenal, brilliant guy. And again, it's just a beautiful movie about the role fungi have on the planet, but then there's a significant component related to psychedelics. And Louis has always thought that, as many others have, that there's a big part of psychedelics related to nature and nature connectedness. And there's also data that alcoholics don't often have a mystical experience because they require a higher dose. And nature connectedness can hopefully bring someone closer to having a mystical experience. So we put together a trial with Louis where they're getting psilocybin. These are alcoholics. But at the beginning of their journey, they watch a 40-minute curated video from Louis. I'm going to show you a little snip here at the end. So they take the psilocybin and they watch for 40 minutes, very up close, these visuals with music, and then they put on eye shades and music. And the idea is that we're priming the tank. It's a small study, 20 patients, it's a pilot trial. that we're priming the tank for them to get this nature connectedness and ultimately have a mystical experience and ultimately stop drinking. That's the goal. And so we started this back in March, and as I said, now we're 3/4 of the way through. We don't have any data. I don't have any data to share with you yet, but we will. And it's been a really, really interesting project. The other area that we're looking at to start is a psilocybin-assisted therapy trial for prolonged grief. So grief that goes on beyond 6 months. And grief is, a combination of PTSD, depression about the loss, anxiety about living without the person you lost. And the pandemic has really done a big number on people for that. As you know, when people watching their loved one die on an iPad in an ICU, they can't be together, can't have funerals. There's a lot of sort of carnage from all that. And so we think this is an important target for psilocybin. And Francois Borzat, who's a somatic psychologist, and Chris Adrian, who's a palliative care doctor at Children's, they actually have a program now in Jamaica for parents who have lost a child. And they've had 2 retreats, and they're going to have more. And our connection with her, Keith and I thought, why don't we do this for the bigger grief population? So we have some funding for it, and we're going to hopefully be starting that within the next 6 months. We don't have any data on that either. So what does the future hold? It's clear there's something going on here. This is a really important area of the neurosciences. Well, the corporate universe has dove into this big time. This is just an example, the Noetic Fund, nice term. And look at their checkerboard of startups that they're supporting. So this is a psychedelic investment portfolio. And there's a lot of people banking big on this. You may have heard of Compass Pathways. They're doing a phase 2 trial now for depression. Parallel with the phase 2 trial we're doing with Usona. Compass is much bigger. Usona is not on the NASDAQ. Their market cap is almost $1.4 billion. And they don't even have a drug out yet. They're still in phase 2 trials, but you can just see the excitement. Atai is connected to Compass. I think they own about half of Compass. And then there's all these other companies that you may have heard of, Field Trip, MindMed, Numinous, and there are many more. So this is a really wide open area, and we don't know where it's going to go. The other thing that may really change this is, again, these decriminalization rules and things such as this. The U.S. Ninth Circuit Court here's a historic case to allow psilocybin therapy for people who have nothing else, the right to try. And of course, Keith found this on a website called Microdose. I'm sure you all go to Microdose regularly. I didn't even know that there was such a website. I just learned this. But again, very interesting to see that these things are going on now. And so it's a really kind of the Wild West of psychedelics again, but the clinical trials, I would say, are going on very, very well. So if you're interested in learning more, there's some wonderful reading. This is some suggested reading I have. Albert Hoffman's book is fascinating. Acid Dreams is excellent. I talked to Bob Fagan, who's, I think, in the audience. Professor Fagan over there, who's actually writing a book about Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And Ken Kesey is featured in this book, as he knows, and it's an incredible history. Sacred Knowledge is one of our required readings for the CIIS course, Psychedelics and Religious Experience, incredibly good. How to Change Your Mind, obviously. James Fadiman wrote a great book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. He's probably the world's expert on microdosing and writes a fair amount about that. And this was a book out by Charlie Grobe. It was a compilation called Hallucinogens. Came out almost 20 years ago. Excellent as well. And then finally, Francois Borzat's book called Consciousness Medicine is superb. And her take on indigenous wisdom and entheogens and expanded states, really, really good. If you prefer podcasts, the Tim Ferriss Show and Sam Harris are excellent. They routinely interview people in the psychedelic universe and do a very good job of interviewing people. This is a great movie that came out about 3 or 4 years ago. It features the Hopkins group and others, NYU. You can download it on YouTube, called A New Understanding, and it's very, very well done. It's only about an hour long. And I just want to close with a couple points here. You know, this was an opinion piece that came out in the LA Times just about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, written by Rick Doblin, the leader of MAPS, about the need for education of healthcare providers. And he thinks, and I know he's right, that healthcare is not ready for this. And I think a lot of education is going to have to roll out over the next 5 years, 10 years for these compounds to come out into the healthcare world to be managed rationally and safely and effectively. So in conclusion, the psychedelic renaissance is in full swing. We have massive mental health issues that provide our society, and our current treatments don't work that well with low success and poor durability. But psychedelic-assisted therapies with these shamanistic roots really offer a paradigm shift with a more expansive psychospiritual approach that promotes brain plasticity and connectivity. One of the most important points here is this transdiagnostic application across all these different disorders, and which really makes it, again, I think, a game changer for behavioral health care. We think FDA approval will happen for MDMA within the next year or two, and psilocybin for depression, hopefully by 2025. The mechanistic mysteries remain, and I think this is one of the most interesting areas within the neurosciences right now, beyond behavioral health, also for stroke, TBI, and dementia. This question of the betterment of humanity, including the worried well, through psychedelics remains an intriguing question, both for macrodosing and microdosing. You know, should we all be doing a psychedelic journey every year or two? Clearly not everyone, but might this be something that would help people, help with their creativity, help with their relationships? It's open to discussion, and this will be discussed in great detail, I'm sure, in the coming years. And then I think, you know, fortunately or unfortunately, the corporatization and monetization of these therapies is inevitable. But hopefully wisdom and love and creativity will be guiding principles, and corporate greed won't upend this into something unseemly. I just want to end with a video. Maybe you can turn down the lights a little bit more. I'm just going to show you a few minutes of this. Do we have time just for like 3 minutes? Is that okay? Okay. So this is from Louis Schwartzberg, and just enjoy. This is a snippet of what our patients see in the alcohol trial, and some of his cinematic beauty here. Maybe turn the lights down here. You can turn the lights off on me. goes on and on. Probably watch it for hours. Very stunningly beautiful stuff. But you get a sense of what the patient might experience. And with that, I'll stop and say thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. At this time, we'll begin taking questions from our audience here in the Agrid Dining Room, as well as from our Zoom audience. For our audience here in the Agrid Dining Room, we ask that you orderly line up behind the microphones, keeping as much space between each other as you can. And then one of us will direct you to ask your questions. When you ask your question, please state your name, college, class year, and major. For our audience on Zoom, please submit questions via the Q&A function and state your affiliation with the college as well. As always, preference goes to students.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm a senior at Claremont McKenna College, and I'm an applied math and neuroscience major. So my question comes from, how would you compare the effectiveness of these psychedelics compared to transcranial magnetic treatments with depression?
Good question. So TMS, we actually are doing that for depression in our brain health group, and it is effective. I don't do it. I think the numbers are modest. They're probably, again, not as robust. And with TMS, it requires repeated treatments, a lot of treatments, and it's obviously a very different mechanism. I'm not sure we know how it works. Just also, like, we don't know how psychedelics work very well. But it's definitely a therapy in the toolkit, and I think it's something to be used. And the fact that it's not a drug is good. That it's not something you have to take like some of the antidepressants. But my hunch is, and I may be biased, but that the psychedelic-assisted therapies will be more potent because it's a more fundamental change that may occur.
Thank you.
But good question.
Okay,
Thanks.
very quickly, I'll just say, for anyone asking a question, please feel free to state your name, what college you go to, what year you're in, any quick introduction. And then after this question, we'll move on to a Zoom question. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. My name is Paris. I'm a senior at CMC. I'm kind of curious what you think would happen to society if tomorrow, and I know the medical community is not ready for this, obviously, but what do you think would happen to society if everybody taking like an SSRI or an MAOI, traditional pharmaceutical antidepressant, switched to a controlled microdosage of psilocybin like tomorrow?
Whoa, it'd be chaos. It's a good question. You know, I want to emphasize that for all of these studies that I was showing, these are macro doses. These are large doses of psilocybin. You know, microdosing is usually taking a tenth of a dose. It's a sub-psychedelic dose. You're not supposed to have, you know, a psychedelic experience. In fact, you're not really supposed to even know you're on it. And you have subtle changes in your behavior, your mood, your outlook, possibly. But frankly, there's very little work going on. As I mentioned, James Fadiman is probably the expert on microdosing. But I think that the SSRIs would be more effective than microdosing for some people, and maybe not for others. I mean, some of again, there's a lot of anecdotal reports, and James Fadiman has collected many on microdosing of people having resolution of their depression and anxiety and other things. So I'm sure a subset would be would see benefit, but I think for a lot of them it would not have a beneficial effect. So we'll see. Good question.
Thanks.
Hi. Thank you. Hi, my name's Jamie. I'm a senior here at CMC, and I'm a media studies major. My question kind of revolves around kind of what could go wrong. Well, I hate to be that guy, but what could like go wrong? Because I have like acquaintances and people I know who have like hallucinogen persistent perception disorder, and it seems like in all the trials, you're not really running into complications like this. So I was wondering what the current scientific thinking is on stuff like that that has occurred.
So you said, sorry, someone who had that persistent hallucination syndrome, is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So apparently that's a very rare, so this idea of having flashbacks, right? There are stories, particularly back in the 60s and 70s, of people having sort of recurring bad experiences from their LSD or psilocybin trip. That in the current clinical trial setting is essentially non-existent. They haven't been reported. And that's not to say it's not a risk, but I think what's really important to emphasize here is that the therapeutic paradigm here has a lot more guardrails around it. There's a lot more screening of people, there's a lot more prep, and during the journey you have 2 guides with you, at least 1, but more often than not 2. In our group we have 2. And then there's the processing afterwards. There's also exclusion criteria. So hard exclusion criteria right now are people with a history of schizophrenia or a family history of schizophrenia. So, and manic depression as well. So, those are certain ailments that unfortunately, at least now, are not going to be addressed. But I think that syndrome of this sort of persistence of this sort of psychedelic experience in a terrible way, that is just not happening now in the current paradigm. So I think the risk is really low, but again, with the caveat that you have all these guardrails in creating the trials. There's no doubt in my mind that, this will happen though, when it's in decriminalized settings, when people are doing it. I've also heard on multiple occasions that ayahuasca, there's all these ayahuasca retreats you can go to in South America, Costa Rica, and some people really have profoundly bad ayahuasca experiences. And, I heard Tim Ferriss describe it as a roll of the dice, or, know if you're going to pull a joker sometime and get one of these really bad experiences. So, these are super powerful agents. They need to be taken very seriously. When I was in college here, a lot of people were doing psychedelics, and the recreational use can be fun, but it can go off the rails quickly, and I think everyone needs to realize that and be responsible. And that's the way, hopefully, these are going to come back into mainstream medicine. That's the hope.
Thank you.
So at this time, the only questions we'll be taking are from folks who are already standing. So that's all. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ren. I'm a junior at CMC, and I'm kind of curious as to your decision to group MDMA in with the more classic psychedelics, because I guess from some reading I've done, it seems like they have some kind of different mechanisms in the brain, and I've seen some studies with some kind of concerning long-term results from MDMA use. I think in terms of lower serotonin levels, if I'm remembering what I read correctly, but I was just curious if you have thoughts on MDMA versus the more traditional psychedelics.
Yeah. So MDMA is considered not a classic psychedelic. As I mentioned, it's a more complex molecule, and its actions are more complex. The MAPS group, who are now in phase 3 trials, have gone through this in excruciating pain with the DEA and the FDA to get these trials approved. And they have shown none of these long-term effects they have a 3-session paradigm, right? So they do it for 3 sessions over the course of 18 weeks, and then they're done. Chronic use of MDMA or ecstasy, that's probably a different deal. And I think that also you have to keep in mind that when you get MDMA on the street, for example, you may not be getting pure MDMA. It may be cut with something else. So I think MDMA has more issues on some heart issues and things you have to be careful with. It's a little bit more, you can overdose on MDMA from physiologic issues, unlike with psilocybin and LSD. But I think in the current paradigm, it's very safe. And we haven't seen those things. So, and it is different, it's not as visual. Psilocybin, LSD, they're more visual, more out there. But in MDMA is really about kind of generating this empathy and the person getting less terrified of their trauma and sort of accepting and working through it. It's different, clearly different. You're right.
Thanks, that's super interesting.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Kira. I'm a junior at CMC. I'm an economics major. Real funny there. It's super normal. And I was curious, so you were mentioning how we don't really have that much understanding of the mechanics of some of these psilocybins or really how they work. I'm not super well versed in this, but considering we don't inherently know all the super specifics of how psychedelics are working, how are you measuring success? Like, what considers these trials to be effective? I'm curious what that might look like.
No, that's a great question. So, the neurobiology is not totally worked out. This concept of the default mode network, those things there's a lot of debate about that. But the way the trials are done, they have primary and secondary endpoints. And you can look at any of these papers and they have very detailed established metrics for, there's a depression scale, there's multiple depression scales, there's anxiety scales, there's the mystical experience scale. And so those are what they're measuring. So when the patients come back in, they measure those at different time points. So it may be 2 days after the journey, then at 4 weeks, and then 18 weeks, 6 months. And they look and they compare to, if it's a placebo-controlled trial or a different comparator. Or some of the trials are looking at, say, 25 milligrams of psilocybin versus essentially a microdose, and seeing what the changes are, and then doing all of those standard measures. So these are very rigorous, standardized clinical trial methods to understand. Do we know the mechanism? Not perfectly, for sure.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm a senior at CMC, majoring in philosophy and economics. So in the book Hallucinations by Oliver Sacks, he mentioned that on an LSD trip, he saw a new shade of blue. But
Go ahead, I'm sorry, I lost that. In which book?
Hallucinations by Oliver Sacks. He mentioned seeing a new shade of blue after an LSD trip. But I've also heard of like kaleidoscope type visuals from LSD experiences. Can you explain a little bit about the mechanics of these like visual projections and what they can tell us about like how LSD and psychedelics function in our brains?
That's a tough one. I operate on the brain macro scale with a microscope. I can't see into the details of the neurons and the synapses, but it does come down to the synapses, and these drug LSD, it is a serotonin agonist. The serotonin system is not a big system, but it's a selective group. And one of the interesting things that happens with LSD and psilocybin is something called synesthesias, where your senses get mixed together. Like a color will have a sound, or a sound will elicit a color, a burst of color. And we think that, again, this sort of rigid wiring of the brain is disarmed and disassembled while these compounds are running through your bloodstream. And beyond that, we don't have a great understanding. I think it's really one of the most fascinating things of this whole area is how do they work and why do they work. Others feel that there's this going beyond, to the sort of meta existential areas of connecting with these spiritual, universal, connecting with the cosmos, and whether whether LSD and psilocybin are actually connecting you to some higher level into the universe. I mean, that's what a lot of people think. Again, that will be very hard to prove. But, you know, maybe they're right. You know, I don't think we know. I think the one thing about psychedelics that I have learned in all of my reading and experience and studying this is that we don't know as much as we think we know. And my mentor in the course that I'm taking is David Presti. You may have heard of David Presti. He's a neuroscientist. He's a professor at Berkeley. Brilliant guy, written a bunch of books, very intrigued by psychedelics. And I think one of the things he keeps bringing up in his basic neuroscience textbook is we really don't understand the wonder of the nervous system that well. We kind of know the wiring, we know the anatomical structures, we know the transmitters, but we got a long ways to go. So, you know.
Thank you.
That's my answer. Incomplete.
Hi, my name's Grant Stuckey. I'm a freshman at CMC, and I'm thinking about majoring in chemistry.
Majoring in what?
Chemistry, I think.
Good for you.
Not totally sure yet. My question is, all of these trials seem to have therapy afterwards. And is it possible that the psychedelics simply make you more prone to the therapy methods, or does
More what? Speak up.
more prone to the therapy methods, or is there
More prone to the therapeutic method?
Yes, or is there actual like psychological changes that go on in the actual trip?
Well, you know, there is this thing called the placebo effect, and you know that's a very real thing in medicine and any clinical trial. But I think looking at these trials very carefully structured with different treatment arms, it's hard to just put it on the therapy effect. But I think without the therapy, without the psychological counseling on either side of the journey, you know, the prep and the integration, they won't work. And you know, for someone just to say, I mean, what we don't want to happen, say in Oregon, where they've legalized psilocybin and they have a whole paradigm they're going to do, you don't want to just say, here's 25 milligrams of psilocybin, go have a great time. You're going to feel your depression will be gone tomorrow. You know, it doesn't work that way. And again, this goes back to this shamanistic model that has been around for thousands of years of people that are experienced guiding an individual through whatever their ailment is, and being very careful. And I think that is the model. And to just do it without that we're asking for trouble. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Embry. I'm a post-bac pre-medical student at Scripps College. And my question is, do you, some people had already brought this up, but I was pretty impressed by the lack of side effects that you had in your studies. And do you think that it's the patient selection process that's the most important, the presence of an accompanier, or a debriefing process afterwards that you think is most, has these lack of negative results? And then I guess another question is there a particular species of mushrooms that you tend to use in your studies, and why?
So on the first question as to really, you're asking why there are so few adverse events and what's the most important part of the therapy. I mean, I really think it's the whole ball of wax. You know, I don't think that, I think the integration is really important. And when you talk to guides, that's where, who've been dealing with this, like the people at Hopkins who've done there's a woman, Mary Casimano, she's done, I think, over 400 journeys in their clinical trials. And the integration is critical. So disassembling and trying to understand what you went through and how you're going to change your behavior, I think is really critical. I mean, you do need to, you hope the individual has this mystical experience, however you measure it, that you really let the molecules take you to where you need to be. And it may be very challenging, it may be really unpleasant, you may be crying, you may be in terrible anguish. You may think you're going to die. And they say that's okay. You know, that's what the guides are there for. And they will say, you know, just go with it, let it go. You're not going to die. We're here, and you know they're not going to die. And so that guiding in these difficult parts, the rough parts of the journey, and then the integration those are probably the two things that are by far the most important, I would say.
And the integration afterwards, that's while they're sober? Or is it immediately afterwards they're sober?
No,
still?
it's usually it's the following day, and then usually 2 or 3 times more spread out over a few weeks. So, yeah. And what was the second question again?
Is there a particular species of mushroom that you tend to
Oh.
use?
No, there's a bunch of psychedelic species, and for all of these trials, it's a pharmaceutical grade psilocybin. It's a standard molecule, so it's just one molecule. Now, there are a number of companies that are working on these designer molecules, and we'll see whether some of those are used. There may be more short-acting. There's a group of people that think, well, you don't really need 5 or 6 hours. You need 30 minutes, and you're going to be good. They're trying to. This is this weird economic approach and corporatization. Well, you know, your brain doesn't need to be exposed for 4 or 5 hours. We can just do 30 minutes. We can get you in and out much more quickly. You're going to get the same effect. That's what some people think. And, I, for one, I'm not sure that that's, the dose is going to be enough. There's not going to be enough sustained activity with that, we'll call it dissolution of the default mode network, for it to really have a lasting impact. But we'll see. Those studies are going to be done.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Sandy, and I am a senior here at CMC. I also first want to thank you for mentioning that this information comes from shamanistic cultures, because it's something in particular that I am interested in. I have heard from different shamans and different indigenous communities or them warning us about the use of psychedelics, because it is a ritual and it is a medication within these cultures. So my question for you is, what is your opinion on these warnings, and what is your opinion in terms of appropriation versus appreciation of this medicine, of this knowledge, of this ritual that it is for these indigenous and shamanistic communities?
That's a great question. And I will tell you, at the CIIS course, that's a huge focus of giving respect to these shamanistic cultures where these practices came from. And a lot of them are still, alive and well. And but they are being appropriated and often not appreciated. And so I think it's a really important thing. And that's why the last point on my slide is about the corporatization of this whole process. And I think some of that's going to be lost. It perhaps already is. And we've aligned ourselves with USONA, which is more kind of the old hippies compared to Compass Pathways, which is much more corporate, valued at over $1.4 billion. And maybe in the end they're gonna make billions of dollars. But we've aligned with USONA, and we've aligned with Francois Borzat, who's this somatic psychologist who's spent all this time in indigenous cultures, particularly in Mexico. And I think that is really part of the history here that we have to respect, because without that, we wouldn't be having this conversation. That's a great point.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your questions, and thank you for being with us here tonight, Dr. Kelly.
Thank you.